GoForThe2.com in with the Week 2 college football predictions. What can you say? Week number 1 was rocky. I know it. We're looking to get back on track this coming Saturday with marquee games this coming weekend. Let's get right into it. Very intriguing battle, TCU and Arkansas. This is a TCU team that's coming off a 63-0 win at home against Jackson State. It's a rematch of last year. Arkansas won this game 41-38 in overtime. Austin Allen led a fourth quarter comeback to give the Razorbacks the win in Fort Worth. The game now is played in Fayetteville. This is a team in TCU that was 6-7 last year. Those 6 wins came against FBS opponents with a combined overall record of 23-39. Their 7 losses came against FBS opponents with a combined overall record of 60-30. This is one of the worst statistical defenses under Gary Patterson last year. They allowed 187 rushing yards on the ground to opposing offenses. They were also 1-5 at home and lost those 5 games by 12.2 points per game. But I think that's the matchup you want to see play out. Can Arkansas run the football effectively on that front 7 of TCU? I think they can. Arkansas rushed for 236 yards on the ground last week in their win against Florida A&M. Since 2016, the Razorbacks are 6-0 every time they rush for over 200 and have won those 4 FBS games by 20 points per game. 2 came against FCS, 4 came against FBS teams, and they won those games by 20 points per game. I think that's the difference in this matchup. I think they're a big physical offensive line that can run the football consistently with running back Whaley and work off of play action with Austin Allen and keep Kenny Hill and that finesse offense on the sidelines. I expect Arkansas to dominate this ballgame. I think they have a significant size advantage offensively and defensively. Look for them to wear down a smaller defensive front in TCU. I'm still not sold on the defensive side of the ball for Gary Patterson. The last couple of years now, it's not just 1 year, it's 2 years. 187 rushing yards allowed last year, 182 rushing yards allowed in 2015. The year that they had Trevon Boykin and they made that run, ranked number 3 in the country, they only allowed 120 rushing yards on the ground. So it's a consistent decline now, and I think it'll carry through this season, and more importantly, in this ball game. I'm looking for Arkansas to dominate this game anywhere from 14 to 20 points this coming Saturday in Fayetteville. Another rivalry game is Iowa State. Iowa won this matchup 42-3 last year, and they're coming off a very convincing win against Josh Allen in Wyoming, 24-3. They held Wyoming to 59 rushing yards on the ground last week. They ran the football with James Butler and Akron Wadley, but I still wasn't sold on the consistency of quarterback Nathan Stanley last week. He struggled in some key critical third down situations, and I think that's the matchup that you'll see play out on the road in Ames. He's going up against a prolific offense led by Iowa State quarterback Jacob Park. Jacob Park is one of the most underrated quarterbacks in college football. He was a freshman last year. He came from Georgia. Last week, he completed 27 of 35 passes, 77%, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. But this is a much different offense in Iowa State with Matt Campbell than you saw last week with Josh Allen in Wyoming. Josh Allen did not have their leading rusher from last year, Brian Hill. They didn't have speed at the running back position to give offensive balance. Iowa State has playmakers. They have 2 top running backs in Montgomery and Warren that can put pressure on Iowa's defense on the perimeter, and I think that's the difference that will allow Jacob Park to work off a play action and find Alan Lazard, his big play wide receiver, vertically in the passing game. More importantly, Iowa State only allowed 119 rushing yards on the ground last week in their win and did give up 259 through the air. That's their weakness, the secondary. I'm not so sure Nathan Stanley could attack that secondary vertically because of the lack of speed on the outside for Iowa, and that's why I like the Cyclones to get the 7-point victory over Iowa in this ballgame. Let's turn our attention to another matchup, Northwestern and Duke. Northwestern coming off a very lackluster victory over Nevada, 31-20. They actually trailed 17-7, and then trailed 20-17 in the fourth quarter before pulling away 31-20 in Ryan Field. They now go on the road. Duke is 1-0. They put up a 60 spot against an FCS opponent. But again, I think Justin Jackson and that offensive line in Northwestern can wear down Duke's smaller defense up front. This was a Duke defense last year that wore down in run support. They gave up over 190 rushing yards per game, and I think it continues in this ball game. That'll open up the play-action passing attack for Clayton Thorson, and I think this is a convincing win for Northwestern. I'm calling for a 40-20 Wildcat victory in this matchup. Another intriguing battle is Notre Dame and Georgia. Georgia dominated a solid Appalachian State team. They rushed for 221 yards on the ground. Sony Michel had 87 rushing yards and a touchdown. Nick Chubb, 96 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. But it came at a price because their starting quarterback, Jacob Eason, was lost for the year with an ACL and ankle injury. Jacob Fromm, the true freshman, comes in and will start this ball game. He played last week, completed 10 of 15 passes, 147 yards and 1 touchdown. But I think Georgia relies on the rushing attack in this ballgame to take the pressure off of Fromm, look for him to work off of play action. Notre Dame played very well last week against Temple. They dominated that matchup 49-16. They held Temple under 100 yards rushing. That was a bright spot for that defense that gave up 180 rushing yards to opposing offenses in 2016. Brandon Wimbush, their starting quarterback, played very well, rushed for over 100 yards, and did throw for 187 yards through the air. But this is a different defense that he'll be facing with Georgia in terms of speed on the defensive tackles and speed in the secondary, led by Dominic Sanders. This is a defense last week in Georgia that really held Appalachian State in check. They only gave up 143 passing yards to quarterback Taylor Lamb, only allowed 136 rushing yards with Jalen Moore. That's a solid effort. They did allow 7 of 18 on third down conversions, but they did record 2 sacks as well. Look for Kirby Smart to play man-to-man coverage on the outside. Look for them to force Brandon Wimbush to beat them over the top and read coverage. Kirby Smart, one of the best defensive coordinators in forcing quarterbacks to read coverage. I think that's where the mismatch holds. I think they will not have to rely on Jacob Fromm from an offensive perspective because of Georgia's ability to run the football consistently. I think play action will be there in this matchup. I don't put a lot of weight into Notre Dame's win over Temple. Temple was without their starting quarterback in Phillip Walker and Jahad Thomas, their leading rusher from last year, that both moved on to the NFL. That accounted for 97% of the rushing production last year for the Owls. They also lost starting offensive lineman Deion Dawkins as well. So keep that in mind when you break down that Notre Dame win over Temple last week in South Bend. I think Georgia gets a convincing victory in this matchup. It's a night game, but look for the Bulldogs to strike the upset anywhere 10 to 14 points over Notre Dame in this matchup. Another intriguing battle is USC and Stanford. USC, very lackluster win over Western Michigan, 49-31. They trailed. They were tied going into the third quarter. Sam Darnold, lackluster to say the least. No touchdowns, 2 interceptions. This is a rushing attack in USC that Ronald Jones was able to get going, and they needed his output in that matchup. This is a defense, too, in USC that gave up 263 rushing yards on the ground to Western Michigan. And that's the matchup you want to see play out going up against a blue-collar team in Stanford coming off a bye. Couple of factors. Stanford is 5-2 over the last 7 games against USC. They've won those games by 8.8 points per game. When you look at the last two losses have come in 2013 and 2014 by USC. Last year, Stanford dominated the matchup 27-10 in that ballgame. But here's the thing that you want to see play out. Stanford's coming off a bye. A lot of people think a bye week is a benefit for this offense and, more importantly, for David Shaw to game plan against USC. I don't look at it that way. It's coming after week number 1 of the season. To me, an early bye could disrupt timing, not only on the quarterback to wide receiver relationship, but the continuity and cohesiveness of an offensive line looking to gel in the early part of this year. There is no preseason in college football, so the early games allow teams to build continuity in terms of timing for an offense. So yeah, it might benefit from a game plan perspective, but in terms of timing, it could be a detriment, and that's where I look for when I break down this matchup. I think USC has a speed advantage over Stanford secondary in this ball game. This is a Stanford secondary that allowed 224 passing yards to opposing offenses last year. This is also a Stanford team that struggled against the better teams on their schedule last year. They were 4-3 against opponents last year with a combined overall record of 57-34. They ran the table in the second half of the season. They were 6-0. Those wins came against a combined FBS opponents with a combined overall record of 27-46. Now, every time Stanford is able to rush for over 200, they win games. They were 7-0 last year against FBS opponents, and they won those games by 17.7 points per game. They're coming off a 289 rushing yard performance in Australia against Rice. But this is a different animal in USC's defense. Yes, USC allowed over 200 yards to Western Michigan, but it's a different offensive attack. It's a spread offense that Tim Lester ran with the Broncos. David Shaw's a more pro-style offense. You know where they're going to run between the tackles, and that's why I think USC has an advantage defensively in this ballgame. Last year, USC was 6-0 when they held opponents under 100 yards rushing. They won those ball games by 20.5 points per game. I think Sam Darnold and this offense can attack Stanford's defense vertically. I think they have the speed to really challenge the secondary and loosen up the defensive front seven. That'll open up running lanes for Ronald Jones. And I feel USC dominates this ball game. I think it's in the area of 45-28. I think they get a convincing win in the Coliseum, 45-28. It's high scoring, though. USC dominates Stanford in this ballgame. Another intriguing battle is Washington State and Boise State. Boise State did get the 11-point win over Troy and Brandon Silvers. They did record 4 sacks, which was eye-opening when you look at the sack totals over the last 3 years for Boise State. 47 sacks 3 years ago, 33 sacks 2 years ago, 29 sacks last year. They allowed 177 rushing yards to opposing offenses, but they held Troy under 100 yards rushing in that matchup last week. They now go on the road. This is a rematch from last year. They knocked off Washington State. They jumped out to an early lead and held on to win that matchup 30-28. They now go on the road to face Luke Falk. This is a quarterback in Luke Falk that completed 33 of 39 passes last week. He connected on his first 18 passes. He was 18 of 18 as Washington State dominated Montana 31-0. I think Washington State has the speed to stretch out Boise State in this matchup. I don't think Boise State's a match with Brett Rippon, with that offense going up against Luke Falk and Pullman. I love the defensive front seven as well by Hercules Matafafa and Alex Grinch to come up with a game plan in this ballgame. I think Washington State wins this ballgame by 17 points or more. I just don't think Boise State has the speed to compete in this matchup. Let's talk about another big game, Clemson and Auburn. Clemson is 3-0 over Auburn and has won those games by 9 points per game. Auburn last week dominated Georgia Southern 41-7. Cam Petway did not play in that matchup. He was suspended. Kerryon Johnson and Cam Martin took over. They both rushed for 136 yards on the ground. Jarrett Stidham passed for in the area of about 186 yards through the air last week. They now go on the road to face Kelly Bryant and the Clemson offense that put up 663 total yards of offense in their 59-3 win over Kent. This is going to be a bad matchup for Auburn, in my opinion. A couple of factors. You look at the Auburn secondary last year. In the last 6 games, they allowed 265 passing yards to opposing offenses. They were 3-3 in those ball games. The first 7 games, they were 5-2 and allowed 198 passing yards through the air. They held Georgia Southern in check. They only gave up 8 passing yards to Georgia Southern, but they're a triple option attack. They held them to 4 of 9 in terms of 4 and 9 completions on 9 attempts. When I look at this matchup, though, Auburn does not have a lot of experience in terms of man-to-man coverage or reading offensive formations playing Georgia Southern week number 1 because they don't pass the football. They now go on the road. From a defensive perspective, they're going to be challenged by Deion Kane, Hunter Renfrow, and Ray McLeod and the offense of Clemson to play man-to-man coverage in that ball game. And I think that's where you have a concern if you're an Auburn Tiger fan, coupled with the fact that Jarrett Stidham, no matter how well he played last week, he now goes to his biggest environment that he has faced as a college quarterback. He played against Oklahoma State in the Big 12, played against Kansas State. These are different atmospheres than on the road against the national champs in Death Valley. I think Clemson has a speed advantage in this matchup. I look for the defensive front seven to wear down Auburn's offensive line, make them one-dimensional, and keep an eye out for third down defense. This will be who wins this matchup. Georgia Southern was shut down by Auburn. They were 0-15 on third down conversions. That's because Georgia Southern is a one-dimensional offense. Last week, you're talking about a Clemson defense that held Kent to 1 passing yard last week. 1 passing yard and 120 total yards of offense. You want to compare Georgia Southern and Kent. They're the same type of team, but Kent is a more balanced offense than Georgia Southern is. So think about that effort for Clemson last week. I think this is a convincing win for Kelly Bryant. He showed me something last week. He threw for over 300 yards, rushed for over 70 yards on the ground as well. He's a dual threat. I think he can put pressure on Auburn's defense on the perimeter. I'm just not sold on Gus Malzahn. I'm not sold on Jarrett Stidham. And I think Clemson gets a convincing 17-point victory on Saturday night in Death Valley. I think the speed of the defensive front seven is the difference as well in that matchup. Another intriguing battle is Missouri and South Carolina. Missouri and Drew Lock, 7 touchdown passes last week. I know it was South Missouri State or whatever they played, Missouri State. But Drew Lock is a playmaker. He's got a big play wide receiver in Jamon Moore. He's got Demaria Crockett, who's an outstanding running back. Jake Bentley and the crew did come up with a solid effort last week, 35-28 over Ryan Finley and the crew. Credit Will Muschamp for a solid offense and defensive effort, but when I look at South Carolina's defense, they allowed over 400 passing yards to Ryan Finley. This is a more explosive offense with Drew Lock. I think they can challenge South Carolina's defense vertically. That's the difference. I think Missouri wins this ball game by 13 points or more. Missouri is one of my surprise teams in the SEC this year. In the East, I picked them at 7-5. Drew Lock's the difference, and Drew Lock and the crew get a 13-point victory over South Carolina. Ohio State, Oklahoma. This game is going to come down to can Baker Mayfield challenge that Ohio State defensive secondary that allowed 410 passing yards to Richard Lago. 40 of 65 he completed on that defense week number 1. Now Baker Mayfield comes to town. He completed 19 of 20 passes, over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. To me, Mark Andrews is the difference in this matchup. He caught 7 balls, 134 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I think Oklahoma gets a 7-point victory over Ohio State. I think they have the offensive playmakers to challenge Ohio State's secondary. Look for Lincoln Riley to roll the dice, and Oklahoma gets the 7-point win over the Buckeyes. We're just getting started. Stay with me all season long. College football is great. I just love talking about it.